Trump threatened Canada with 100% tariffs if the country makes a deal with China. The timing was less than 24 hours after Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered a speech at Davos, warning that great powers were using tariffs as leverage and supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. Trump just proved Carney's entire thesis, and the financial implications are staggering. I'm Elle of House of Elle on YouTube. I have a PhD in computer science and I work in finance where spotting geopolitical patterns is part of the job. And right now I'm watching Donald Trump execute what might be the most counterproductive foreign policy move of his second term. Let's establish what actually happened here because the contradictions are remarkable. Last week, Canada and China reached a preliminary trade agreement. Beijing cut tariffs on Canadian agricultural products, particularly canola, while Ottawa increased quotas for Chinese electric vehicle imports to 49,000 units at a 6.1% tariff rate. We have another separate video on this. This is not free trade. China still maintains a 15% tariff on Canadian canola. Canada still has a 6.1% tariff on Chinese EVs. This is a bilateral negotiation to reduce specific trade barriers. Trump's response on January 16th was that he praised the deal. And I'm quoting here, "That's what he should be doing," referring to Prime Minister Mark Carney. It's a good thing for him to sign a trade deal. If you can get a deal with China, you should do that. 8 days later, Trump threatens 100% tariffs over that exact same agreement he publicly endorsed. But here's what financial analysts understand that most commentary misses, in my opinion. This was not actually about the China deal at all. This was retaliation for Carney's Davos speech, where the Canadian Prime Minister laid out a framework for middle powers to resist economic coercion from superpowers. Trump withdrew Canada's invitation to his Board of Peace the day after that speech. We have a separate video on that too. The tariff threat came 24 hours later. And when you work in finance, you kind of learn to interpret official statements for what they reveal about strategic positioning. And what this reveals is policy incoherence masquerading as strength. Let me walk you through why this threat is strategically bankrupt from a financial perspective. First, the scale of economic integration. According to official U.S. statistics, Canada was the top destination for U.S. good exports in 2024, about $350 billion. The two countries trade approximately $3.6 billion daily. Canada is the top export destination for 36 U.S. states. That's not a relationship that you can casually threaten with 100% tariffs. Second, the energy dependency structure. Canada supplies 60% of U.S. crude oil imports and 85% of U.S. electricity imports. Canadian oil imports increased from 1 billion barrels in 2014 to 1.48 billion barrels in 2024. This is physical infrastructure integration. We're talking pipelines, power grids, refinery configurations, optimized for Canadian crude. You cannot simply replace that supply chain with a tariff announcement. Third, the CUSMA protection mechanism, the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, which Trump himself negotiated in his first term, provides duty-free treatment for most Canadian exports that meet rule of origin requirements. According to Congressional Research Service analysis, while Trump has imposed various sectoral tariffs, 35% on many goods under IEEPA, 50% on steel and aluminum, goods compliant with CUSMA rules remain largely exempt. A blanket 100% tariff would require either violating CUSMA or declaring it void, which creates massive legal and economic uncertainty for every North American supply chain. Here's the pattern financial analysts recognize here. Trump threatened 10% additional tariff on Canada in October 2025 over an Ontario government advertisement featuring Ronald Reagan's anti-tariff statements. He terminated trade talks. He called it a hostile act. That threatened tariff never really materialized. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent called it second fiddle, even while traveling with Trump, and the administration just kind of simply moved on. This is kind of boy who cried wolf problem in geopolitical finance. When you make existential threats over policy disagreements, then praise the same policies, then threaten again, markets kind of stop believing you. Credibility becomes your scarcest resource. And before we continue, if you want to sharpen your ability to spot these patterns in real time, to see through the noise and understand what's actually happening, I've written a book called Awake, the Practice of Critical Thinking in an Age of Self-Lies. It's available in ebook and audiobook format. As a subscriber, you get 10% off, and you can read the first chapter for free through the link in the description. Because this kind of analysis is not about having insider information, it's about training yourself to interpret public data correctly. Now, let's discuss what this threat actually accomplishes, and it is the opposite of what Trump actually intends. First consequence, validates the Davos framework. Carney's speech argued that the rule-based international order had experienced a rupture, not a transition, and that middle powers faced a choice: compete with each other for favor or combine to create a third path with impact. He specifically warned that great powers were using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion. Trump threatened 100% tariffs within 24 hours of that speech. He couldn't have provided better proof of Carney's thesis if he'd even tried. Australian Treasurer Jim Chalmers called the Davos speech stunning and said it was widely shared and discussed among the Australian government. Trump's reaction transformed Carney from a middle power prime minister into a de facto spokesman for everyone worried about American economic coercion. Second consequence, it accelerates diversification. According to Statistics Canada data for October 2025, while Canadian exports to the United States fell 3.4% in October, exports to countries other than the United States rose 15.6% to reach a record high. Higher exports to the United Kingdom and China contributed most to that growth. When you work in finance, you understand what is happening here. Canada is systematically reducing single point of failure exposure. That's basic risk management. And Trump's erratic tariff threats are accelerating exactly what he claims to fear: Canadian economic integration with China and other partners. Third consequence, it undermines CUSMA credibility ahead of the 2026 review. The Canada-US-Mexico agreement is scheduled for its first major review in July 2026. Congressional analysis notes that Congress has a constitutional role in trade policy and may consider whether to bolster or curb presidential tariff authorities during this review. But here's the financial mechanism that really matters here. If the US president can arbitrarily threaten to violate a trade agreement that he negotiated because he doesn't like a speech a prime minister gave, what is the point of negotiating anything, right? Every trading partner now has to price in the risk that American commitments aren't really worth the paper they're printed on. That risk premium gets embedded in every future negotiation. Fourth consequence, it makes China look stable by comparison. Think about this from a third country perspective. China offers Canada a multi-year agreement on agriculture tariffs and EV quotas. Trump praises it, then threatens to destroy the entire Canadian economy over the same thing 8 days later. Which country looks like the reliable partner for long-term planning here? The Canadian Chamber of Commerce stated that Canada's government has transparently outlined that the agreement with China is fundamentally about domestic consumers and businesses in Canada and China, not schemes aimed at other markets. That's essentially diplomatic language for this is not about you, and your paranoia is making our point about why we need alternatives to exclude US reliance. So what happens next? Here's what the data tells us about the next phase. First, in my personal opinion, Trump won't implement this tariff. The pattern from October 2025 will probably repeat: big threat, official outrage, gradual de-escalation, nothing happens. Canadian officials have already telegraphed that they're not responding to every Trump social media post. Culture Minister Mark Miller said, "It is what it is. You have to take these things seriously, but we have to control what we control." That's the correct response when dealing with someone who praised your China deal on January 16th and threatened to destroy your economy over the same thing on January 24th. But here's what will happen at the structural level. Canada will continue signing trade agreements with non-US partners. Carney has signed 12 trade and security deals on 4 continents in 6 months. Other middle powers, Australia, EU members, potentially Japan and South Korea, will quietly increase their own diversification efforts. They won't announce it, they will just do it. We have several videos discussing these specific trade agreements on this channel. And the United States will wake up in 5 years wondering why its leverage over allies has diminished, why trading partners are less willing to accommodate American preferences, why the dollar's reserve currency status is facing more serious alternatives. The answer will be traceable to moments exactly like this, where threat inflation destroyed credibility, where policy incoherence replaced a strategy, where a speech warning about economic coercion was answered with economic coercion. According to Global Affairs Canada's latest quarterly report, US GDP growth is projected to moderate to 2% in 2025 as tariff and trade policy uncertainty weigh on production. The US average tariff rate has risen to 11.2%. That's a level not seen since the 1940s. This is not a coincidence. This is what happens when you use tariffs as your primary tool of economic statecraft. The financial markets already understand this. The question is whether American policymakers will figure it out before the structural damage becomes permanent. Trump wanted to punish Canada for seeking alternatives to US dependence, and instead he just gave every other country in the world a compelling reason to do exactly the same thing. For more on how Carney's Davos speech set all of this in motion and why it represented such a dramatic shift in Canadian foreign policy, check out the video on your screen. That speech is the strategic inflection point that explains everything happening right now. I'm Elle of House of Elle on YouTube. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.